Decisions made in Washington, D.C. impact the entire world. Whether we're talking about Gaza, Iran, Ukraine, or somewhere else, what Washington does matters. Ambassador John Bolton has a unique perspective on all of this. He served as National Security Advisor to President Trump during his first term and as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations under President George W. Bush. Ambassador Bolton is as well informed as anyone on world events. He's my guest today on the Capitol Hill Show. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
Let's start with Iran. If memory serves me correctly, there was a time not so long ago that we talked in terms of a nuclear-free Iran. And then somewhere along the line, we started talking about what acceptable levels of enrichment were. When and how did that transition occur?
Well, this was a terrible mistake made in the period roughly 2014-15, as the Obama administration pressed very hard for a nuclear deal with Iran. And although the position of Europe and the United States since the beginning of the century had been no uranium enrichment is permissible, to get a deal, the Obama administration caved in and agreed that Iran could enrich uranium to reactor-grade levels, under the mistaken view that that still kept them pretty far away from weapons-grade levels. And it's not true as a matter of nuclear physics. But it was because the Obama administration was so determined to have a deal with Iran that they were willing to give away the substance of protecting against Iran getting nuclear weapons.
We're now in 2025, and we've had just baby steps toward a dialogue between Iran and the United States. Arguments as simple as to whether or not they would be direct or indirect conversations. But how did we get where we are right now?
Well, I think the Trump decision in 2018 to withdraw from the Obama nuclear deal was exactly the right thing to do, to say we simply don't believe that this is going to stop Iran from pursuing the strategic course they were on to get deliverable nuclear weapons. And we were right. And we returned the economic sanctions to the way they had been in the past. I think we should have done more to exert really maximum pressure against Iran. I think ultimately there's no real security until the regime in Iran itself disappears and the people of Iran have a free government there. But under Biden, they spent 4 years trying to get back into the nuclear deal. It was a fool's errand from the beginning. So now, as administrations have changed, the max pressure campaign is back, but with an opening now toward negotiation. We'll see how this plays out. I'm very skeptical it's worth the time that is being spent on it.
Well, that leads me to the next question, is trust is essential to any successful negotiation. And I'm hard-pressed to think of two nations that trust each other less than Iran and the United States. Can they bridge that gap? And if so, how do you do that?
Well, I don't think from the U.S. perspective there's any chance that that will happen. And, people remember Ronald Reagan saying trust but verify. When you don't get to the trust point to begin with, verification really is superfluous. The fact is that the Tehran Ayatollahs have shown no evidence whatever that they have made a strategic decision to give up their pursuit of nuclear weapons. Just like North Korea, through all the negotiations over multiple administrations, it was always clear that nuclear weapons were North Korea's objective, and they are here too. So we can talk about this for as long as anybody wants to, but we're just giving the Iranians more time to make further progress.
President Trump sent a letter to the supreme leader there, but part of what he did was say, we'd like to negotiate with you, but if you don't, we may attack you. On the supreme leader's part, literally the same day they signed the agreement with the Obama administration, he was leading chants of death to America, death to America. So the question then is either Trump or the supreme leader serious about negotiations?
I think nobody likes to be blamed for having negotiations end. That's a kind of diplomatic dance people do. The Iranians have also come up with a wrinkle on, remember the famous fatwa that supposedly was issued that Iran would never seek nuclear weapons. Now it appears that what the fatwa really said was, it's okay to build nuclear weapons, it's just not okay to use them. which I think is a sign they know exactly what they're trying to get. If the Trump letter was a real invitation to negotiate, then I think it's a waste of time. We'll find out, I think, fairly quickly. But if, like the letter that George H.W. Bush sent to Saddam Hussein in 1991 saying, get out of Kuwait or we will push you out, if it's that kind of letter, then I think that was the right letter to send. And we'll see whether the Ayatollahs take it seriously or whether we're going to have to take military action, whether with Israel or by Israel or jointly, I don't know. But the only safe course for the world here is to eliminate the Iranian nuclear weapons program.
Part of the reason Iran is even willing to consider is they are in a weakened state. Their proxy groups, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, are all considerably weaker than they were just a few years ago. Let's talk about Hamas. Let's shift over to Gaza here. Who is Hamas? We hear that every day in the news, but who is Hamas? What's the history there? And how is it that they are the ones that are making decisions on behalf of 2 million people?
Well, Hamas is a terrorist group. They have been from their very beginning. They're an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're a threat directly to Israel, but really as a locus of terrorist activity, they could be a threat anywhere in the Middle East or around the world. Interestingly, it's a case study of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Hamas is a radical Sunni Islamist group, but the Shia regime in Tehran has been delighted to fund them, and others have as well. But principally in terms of arms supply, military supplies, it's come from Tehran because they share the common enemy in the near term of Israel and the common enemy of the United States over the long term. So what Iran did over a substantial period of time was build up a series of proxy terrorist groups that were part of what the Iranians themselves called their ring of fire strategy around Israel. I just point out geographically, it's a ring of fire around the Gulf Arab states as well, if the Iranians had ever desired to turn it in that direction. I don't for a moment believe that the Iranians expended all this money and all this effort over decades strictly to make Hamas a stronger group. They did it to advance Iranian strategic interest, and that tragically is what began on October the 7th, 2023, with the Hamas attack on Israel.
You mentioned October 7th, and there were 1,200 civilians primarily killed that day by Hamas in Israel. There were 250 hostages, 251 hostages taken. Israel's response has been overwhelming. By some estimates, it's 50,000 plus have been killed in the Gaza Strip area. So you have new generations, children whose mom or dad or brother or sister or all of the above have been killed. You have new generations of hatred. Realistically, is there ever going to be peace in that region?
Well, I think there can be. I think the prerequisite today is changing the regime in Iran. If the source of funding for Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah, the Shia militia groups in Iraq disappeared, it wouldn't eliminate terrorism, but it would sure make a big difference. There are other threats, the threat of Turkish aspirations in the Middle East under President Erdogan, who, hard as it may be to believe, has neo-Ottomanist aspirations for Turkey and Turkish hegemony in the region. But right now, the problem is Iran. I think that if you look at the plight of the Palestinian people from a purely humanitarian point of view, and looking at Gaza specifically, until this cancer of Hamas is eliminated, the people have no chance of a bright future. Now, we've just seen in recent weeks, really for the first time in over a decade, demonstrations by citizens of Gaza against Hamas. And it has been the Israeli objective from the beginning, since October the 7th, to eliminate Hamas's political and military capabilities. I think that's the right objective. And for the people of Gaza, it has to be the right objective. Until they see no prospect of Hamas ever coming back, they'll never be able to look for another alternative.
The United States is playing a role along with Egypt and Qatar on trying to negotiate some sort of permanent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. What role, if any, should the United States play in regime change in Iran?
Well, I think it should be declared American policy that we want another regime in Tehran. You know, their terrorist activities are worldwide, including directed against people in the United States, people in Europe. Their nuclear weapons program is not simply a threat to Israel, it's a threat to the global anti-proliferation regime, which basically rests on the shoulders of the United States. The regime has shown it's capable of the most barbaric behavior against its enemies, against its own people. And so the United States has a real strategic interest, a national interest, in seeing Iran come back under a regime that's responsive to its people and not to the Ayatollahs.
One of the great questions always is, change is good, but what's around the corner? When Saddam Hussein was out of Iraq, that was perceived as a good thing, but then there was utter chaos for a period of time. Now we're 20 years into a constitution. Baghdad is starting to really take off, but there's a long period of time there. Is there a person, a group, an entity that is ready in Iran to actually take over should you have regime change?
Well, I think there are a lot of competing groups. I think what you can say about the situation inside Iran today is that dissatisfaction with the regime is at its highest point since 1979 when they overthrew the Shah. There's economic discontent, there's ethnic discontent. Persians are only 50% of the population. Many ethnic groups, Kurds, Arabs, Baluchis, are very unhappy. The young people, over 2/3 of the population is under 30. They know they could lead a different kind of life. They can see it on the internet. They can see it across the Gulf. The economic dissatisfaction has been substantial for a number of years. And then most recently, the killing of Mahsa Amini 2 years ago, a Kurdish woman that the police said was violating the dress codes the regime insisted upon, has turned 50% of the population against the regime. And it's not just an issue about a dress code. This goes to the legitimacy of the Ayatollah's claims to rule, that they say they speak the word of God. And when people reject the dress code, they're rejecting the basis of the ideology as well. So I think this regime may appear strong from the outside. I think it's very weak inside. Every one of the Ayatollahs, all of the generals in the Revolutionary Guard and the army have mothers, wives, sisters, daughters, all of whom have rejected the regime's legitimacy.
Let's spin our globe and go around and talk a little bit about Ukraine, the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Since President Trump has come on board, they've said we might hold that checkbook a little closer than the Biden administration did. And many of the European countries have been huffing and puffing and saying, well, that maybe the time has come that the EU should create a stronger military presence ourselves. Is this a bad thing or a good thing?
Well, what would be a good thing would be if the individual European nations that are members of NATO lived up to their commitment and spent more on defense. We're not asking it for us, we're telling them it's in their interest. But I think we also need to keep in mind that NATO is an alliance that's in America's strategic interest. It has denied territory to our adversaries. We've added members like Finland and Sweden that see that they are stronger as NATO members. And I think that we have to remember that the threats we face now are increasingly global. The China-Russia axis helps ensure that the war in Ukraine is not just a European war, it's being supported by China. There are North Korean soldiers fighting with the Russians against the Ukrainians. The conflict in the Middle East has the Russians and the Chinese involved, and obviously if China ever moves against Taiwan or makes more moves in the South China Sea, they'll expect Russian backing. So I think we ought to improve the NATO alliance, not weaken it, and we ought to consider making it global, adding Japan or Australia, Singapore, Israel as NATO members, because it really reflects what the real pressures and dangers in the 21st century are going to be. It'll be a global problem.
When the United States beat Japan in World War II, it was a complete and total surrender, and so the United States could dictate the terms. But short of a complete and total surrender, when you have two sides negotiating, realistically, everyone has to give a little bit of something up. What's a fair deal for the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia to make the killing stop?
Well, you know, the Ukrainians think that they're fighting for freedom and independence. And we did that once too. And we thought we were prepared to fight to the finish. So what comes out of negotiations, you don't know going in. But one thing you don't do is give away the store at the beginning of the negotiation. And I think we should support the Ukrainians. I think there are two reasons for that. I think number one, the U.S. has a real national security interest in making sure that unprovoked aggression in areas of concern to us don't go unanswered. I think people on Taiwan are watching what happens in Ukraine very, very carefully. And number two, it's been the U.S. position since 1945 that peace and security in Europe is in our vital national interest, and the Russians are threatening that. We know this is not a local conflict. Vladimir Putin said as long ago as 2005 that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He's trying to recreate the Russian Empire, and that's a source of danger and instability throughout all the territory of the former Soviet Union.
You mentioned the Russians and the Chinese both being involved in conflicts in other parts of the world, whether that's the Middle East or elsewhere. Every time I hear a threat assessment from the United States Defense Department, I hear China is this great threat. And realistically, I know they have people. I know they have the military hardware. I know they have all the pieces. But realistically, does China want to militarily harm the nation that provides a huge chunk of their economic base, that being the United States?
Well, we'll see what happens now in the trade war that we're in already, perhaps unplanned, but it looks like that's where we are. I think China's aspirations now are to establish regional hegemony along its enormous Indo-Pacific periphery. That means pressuring Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the countries in Southeast Asia, and along its land border with India. I think it has broader global aspirations as well, and it would like to push us out of East and South Asia. I don't think we should allow that to happen. We need to make up for decades of not spending what we should have been spending on military matters, Navy assets in particular. You know, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of people said it was the end of history. We had a peace dividend. We didn't need to keep defense budgets up. It was wrong then, and we've suffered through decades of neglect and decades of not having political leaders in this country who spoke to the American people about why a forward position internationally, a kind of Ronald Reagan peace through strength policy, is what keeps the peace. And we need to get back to that very quickly.
We've seen some evidence that what appears to be Trump's goal with smaller countries by implementing his tariff policies is that they're coming to the table. Vietnam came immediately and said, let's just not have tariffs. We'll have zero, you can have zero. And ultimately, that's a goal. It's great if we can get into a voluntary free trade thing that's good for everybody, certainly good for the United States. China has not gone along with that. Where do you see, how long do you see this trade war going, and where do you see it shaking out in the long term?
Well, I would have done it completely differently because I think there are a lot of problems in trade. It's enormously complicated. I've never wanted to be a trade lawyer. God bless those who are. But the one major problem in the international trading system is China. That is the principal bad actor. They steal intellectual property. They subsidize firms in competition with our firms unfairly. There isn't any open market in China. The state protects the markets it wants to protect. Outsiders can't break into it. And not only do we suffer from that, Europe, Great Britain, Canada, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, we all suffer from it. So the way to have a trade war with China is bring your allies together and say, none of us should tolerate it. Let's act together. If we could get to that point, then I think China would be in a very, very difficult position. And they deserve to be because they're the ones causing the harm.
Final question for you. That is the bonus round. What is the most dangerous place on the planet and why?
Well, I think right now it's still the Middle East. There's a convergence of so many different interests and competing factions and priorities there that's really stopping Iran from getting nuclear weapons, stopping the spread of terrorism. And it's not just coming from Iran, but from Afghanistan as well. That's the real focus. Longer term, for the rest of the century, it's the China-Russia axis. But right now, it's still the Middle East.
Ambassador, always a pleasure.
Good to see you again.